Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Western Mill Chimney. Hello there. We've talked about people and places and events in our scrapbook, and note that few of any spots that most of us have known can claim more sheer color and interest than this place in which we live. We found yarns in our scrapbook about saltwater men and real estate promoters, eccentric millionaires and wandering recluses who lived among us. We've dabbled in events, historical and casual, that have shaped our harbor's history. But tonight we're going a bit afield to find a page about this reach of salt marsh and fir-clad hillsides that we call home. We're going to talk about the pile of brick that leaves a mark on the harbor skyline, that has left a mark in its history, a chimney of all things. Yes, a chimney is hardly the sort of monument that you'd expect to have a story about, but this one has. It had its day in the sun, and strangely enough, it was not only the first of its kind, but the first to be abandoned, to stand quiet and alone, perhaps to fade out of things forever, and perhaps, who knows, just waiting to write another chapter in an interesting story. So much for speculation. When George has taken his customary few seconds for a word from our sponsor, we'll open our scrapbook tonight to the page 316 and read the story of the big smokestack, just as we find it here. All right, George, a word from our sponsor. If you've ever gone down harbor in a boat and scanned the north side of the harbor for landmarks that retain their familiar look as landfalls, you've seen the big brick chimney that dominates the skyline, where the Donovan No. 2 sawmill once filled the air with noise of industry and piles of sawdust high in fuel bins. Its weather-beaten chimney, trussed up with iron hoops and patched here and there, and compared with the towering sweeps of the big concrete stacks at the Aberdeen plywood, it's not so very tall, and probably you have passed by it and not even given it a second glance. If you've scanned the harbor waterfront from the hills behind the town, you've seen it, alone and forlorn amongst the debris of the old mill, and will probably never run again. Or if you've sightseeing toured around Aberdeen's West End, you've looked up to see it standing there like a milepost along the route of the harbor that has traveled from William O'Leary to Ed Lundgren. Oh, it's there all right. If you haven't noticed it, perhaps you will when we've told you the story. It begins in 1917. The mill that most of us today call Donovan's No. 2 really got its start long before that. It was back before Aberdeen Fire that Walter McFarland and Scott Weatherwax picked out the chunk of tide water for a mill site and built a sawdust plant there with the name of the Western Mill Company. It was completed in time to catch the tail end of the good lumber market, then bad news caught up with it. One thing led to another until McFarland, who had been one of the principals in the founding of the Aberdeen Elks Lodge and the president of the old Aberdeen Black Cat Baseball Club, packed off his family for the Philippine Islands, and the mill went into decline, partially receivership. Hayes and Hayes Bank got control of the stock, and when 1917 came along, and with its demand for a bridge of ships across the Atlantic, and the old Lindstrom shipyard nearby, under the name of the Grays Harbor Motor Shipyard Corporation, wanged a few war shipbuilding contracts, the Western Lumber Company began to have value. Adjoining the shipyard, as it was, and with both the shipyard and the mill, rolled by Hayes and Hayes' aggressive little manager, Billy Patterson, the whole thing was turned into a shipbuilding plant, one of the biggest and busiest on the Pacific coast. The old mill had run down and required some rebuilding, and to put it into readiness, several projects were started. Most interesting, the Grays Harbor was the announcement of a 150-foot brick smokestack would be erected to carry the cinders into the sky over Grays Harbor. Now, no one could be expected to get excited over a smokestack. That is, not just an ordinary one, but a brick smokestack caught the fancy of the harbor because there was nothing like it in the sweep of the harbor skyline. The nearest thing to a 150 smokestack of masonry was the towering chimney of the Tacoma smelter, and the new stack was compared to that. To fire up the public imagination, the newspapers told the story. It would be set on a bed of piling, driving more than 100 feet into the harbor's brown mud. It would be built with layer upon layer of red brick. It would have a ladder to reach the top. And as the workmen went at the job of putting up the chimney, Grays Harbor began to watch with interest. Virtually every brick mason on the harbor was on the job, and the waterfront men going down harbor slacked the speed of their craft to watch the great brick piling taking shape. And West End folks compared notes on how far the brick masons could lay in a day and how long it would take to complete it. It was well into 1918 before the big stack was done and harnessed to the mill's boiler, and it cast a plume of smoke across the sky for the first time. Every detail of its operation was new. How much draft, how effective it was, how it would stand the wind and the storms, how many bricks were in it. In the most minute statistics were translated into a story and handed out to the public, which looked it up. Brick masons could boast of having walked around the top of the towering stack, laying the last course of bricks, were local heroes. Folks scanned the sky after every storm to see if it had blown down. It was the proudest mark a big corporation that now drove its mill and shipyard around the clock 24 hours a day to produce ships for the war effort. The big stack was not to enjoy its exclusivity for long. Other brick stacks were built. When the big windstorm of 1921 blew down the Anderson and Middleton flumes, the towering brick stack that stands at the foot of Broadway in Aberdeen went up. There were others, but one at the end of the Old Western was first. It settled a little and cracked, and in the 20s, when the Donovan Lumber Company bought the mill and put it to work, it became the Donovan Mill No. 2. The big chimney was reinforced with steel bands, and it continued to pour a blast of fir wood smoke across the sky and symbolized Grays Harbor industry. In 1929, when the New York stock market plummeted, the nation's business was talking of whacking without really knowing what had gone wrong, and the mill shut down again. And in the nervous in-between periods when folks were expecting the whole thing to blow over and the boom to start again just a day away, remember, prosperity is just around the corner, the mill again stood dark and silent, but the big brick flue, marking the spot where 1 billion board feet had been sawn, stood quietly. Then in the fall of 1930, a slight shift in the lumber market encouraged some of the mills to reopen, and the Donovan firm began to comb the snarls out of the mill and ready it to start again. And then came the excitement that was probably the highlight of the old chimney's career. It was Sunday, November 16, 1930. The mill was to start in another week, if the millwrights could get the work complete in time. There were stacks of new sprawn planks hauled from the Donovan Mill No. 1 on the patched-up docks. Fresh grease dripped from the bearings of the headgear and the conveyors. Brick masons were working on the boilers. Things were going according to plan. But Sunday was a dark day, an ominous day. To look at the sky, intermediate showers dampened things after the November fashion, and then just before 4 o'clock, while the harbor drowsed lazily in the afternoon, the sky seemed to open and dusk was lighted upon a flash light so brilliant that almost every home, building or store on every street and alley of the town, men and women started and exclaimed, Children ran to look at the sky from which the great light had come. Lightning, their elders told them, lightning such as Grays Harbor had not seen in memory of the old-timers. It was a bolt of such brilliance and force that it rocked the salt marshes and the fir trees. And then, but an instant behind it, was the roar of thunder that shook windows and frightened dogs and cats under houses and sidewalks. It was as though the harbor had been dealt the full force of the Almighty's blow of vengeance. Had it happened today, we would have shouted, "An atomic bomb," and tried to remember the direction from which it came. It was over in an instant. One gigantic bolt of electricity out of the overcast sky, one colossal roar that reverberated back from the hills. Then a drizzle of rain began to fall. Most folks were content to talk about it, but a few had seen the corkscrew of a fire blaze down on the harbor, and who knew something about lightning knew it must have struck somewhere. Somewhere was right on the waterfront near the Donovan Mill No. 2. Several carfuls of residents set out to locate the spot, and when they came to Donovan's Mill, they saw it plainly. It was a towering old smokestack. On its west side was a gaping hole more than 20 feet long, a crack that ran for 50 feet more. It was about 100 feet up the brick tower. On the other side of the big flue was another hole, smaller than that spent the force of the bolt had just punctured the flue. The steel bands had melted, bricks scattered and were strewn over 100 feet. Photographers, hearing of it, hurried to take pictures of the phenomenon. Newsmen covered the story from as far away as Portland. The old stack had had its day in the sun, but the story was not finished yet. No, the lightning bolt was not the end of the chimney, nor the last word of the strange phenomena that had brought it fame. Luther Shaw, Aberdeen brick mason, contracted to repair the flue. Luther had seen thousands of brick chimneys struck by lightning, but he said that he had never seen anything like this. It was an explosion which had turned the great stack, the bricks 18 inches thick at one point, into a hole, were burned away as though by a giant torch. At first it was thought that the big stack would have come down, but after a thorough survey it was found that it could be saved, and in December of 1930 it was patched up to outlast the mill that it served. Today the mill's tumbling down from half a decade of neglect, and it's doubtful if it will ever operate again. But the big stack, the first of its kind on Grays Harbor skyline, the most talked about of its day, and the one that withstood heaven's greatest bolt of wrath, still stands to remind us of the resiliency of the harbor, and a prominent place tonight in this, our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.